The cold air cut through his worn-out jacket as the wheelchair rolled unevenly over the sidewalk cracks. His breath came out in shallow puffs, the oxygen tube barely helping as he struggled to sit upright. People passed him by, eyes glued too. Their phones were fixed straight ahead, pretending not to see. Some may have noticed the four-pole beside him, or the way his trembling hands clutched the armrests, but no one stopped. No one asked. And for the man in the wheelchair, a U.S. veteran who once wore a uniform with pride, this wasn't just another bad day. This was the end of the road. He had been discharged from the hospital just hours earlier. No family to call. No one waiting. Just a brief apology from an overworked nurse and a cab voucher pressed into his hand like a parting gift. They told him there was no more space, no more support they could offer. "Sorry, sir," she had whispered, avoiding his eyes. That was the last voice of kindness he'd heard before the hospital doors closed behind him. It wasn't the first time he'd been let down, but this time the weight felt final. Once he had stood tall. His hands had once held a rifle, his feet had marched through foreign sand, and his voice had echoed in commands and laughter with his brothers in arms. But now, his only companion was the hollow rattle of the wheelchair's wheels and the fading memories of people who had long stopped calling. Life had become a quiet war of survival and he was losing. The city moved around him like he didn't exist. Neon signs flashed above, and the scent of street food drifted through the cold. Somewhere nearby, a man laughed. A child begged her mother for a toy. Life went on, but not for him. Not anymore. He found a spot near the corner of a busy intersection, just outside a clothing store. It wasn't safe, but it didn't matter. He parked his wheelchair and sat there, too exhausted to even look up. A cardboard sign rested in his lap, something he had scribbled on with a shaky hand before leaving the hospital. It was all he had left to say. The words weren't a cry for money or sympathy. They were a silent scream into the noise of a world that had turned its back on him. As hours passed, not a single person slowed down. Some glanced. Most didn't. The crowd moved like waves around a rock, flowing past his motionless figure. The sun dipped behind buildings, and the chill deepened. His fingers ached. His chest felt heavier with each breath. He wondered how many people knew what it felt like to serve with honor and then be forgotten. There had been a time when he believed things would be different. He had imagined retirement with dignity, maybe a small home near the woods, maybe a dog. He thought his service would mean something. He never expected to be reduced to this, discarded by the very system he had risked his life to protect. He stared at the ground, lost in thought. He wasn't afraid of dying. What scared him more was the thought that no one would notice when he was gone. That he would just disappear quietly, the way he had been slowly disappearing for years. His mind drifted to a memory from the past, his best friend from the Marines, laughing on their last night before deployment. They had made promises back then to look after each other, to live fully if they made it back, but only one of them did. And now, even that promise felt broken. He closed his eyes. The sounds of the city dulled around him, like he was slipping underwater. He felt lightheaded. Maybe this was it. Maybe the cold would take him before the night did. Then it happened. A faint touch, almost hesitant, tapped his shoulder. It was so gentle he almost thought he imagined it. But he opened his eyes, and there, beside him, stood someone. Not a doctor, not a nurse, not a passerby rushing to the next thing. A woman, maybe in her 30s, dressed in black slacks and a coat that didn't quite match the style of the crowd. Her expression wasn't pitied, was something deeper, like she saw him. Really saw him. Her hand stayed on his shoulder for a moment, steady and calm. No words yet, just presence. He blinked, unsure what to say. Was she lost? Did she think he needed help crossing the street? But she didn't look away, and she didn't step back. Something stirred in him, a flicker of confusion, then curiosity. He couldn't remember the last time someone willingly stood still near him, let alone reached out. His voice was weak when he tried to speak, and she gently raised her hand, signaling it was okay. He didn't have to say anything yet. In that instant, everything around them seemed to slow down. The people walking by faded into the background. The city noise dulled to a distant hum. All that remained was the silence between the two of them, filled with unspoken questions and something like hope. Or maybe just a paused enough of one to stop something irreversible from happening. But who was she? Why did she stop when no one else did? What did she see in him that others overlooked? He didn't know yet, but her eyes held something firm, like she had seen pain before and wasn't afraid of it. As the wind picked up and his fingers trembled from the cold, her hand didn't move, and neither did she. Something had shifted. Wasn't alone anymore. Not quite. Not yet. But what came next would change everything. The silence between them lingered, stretched thin by the weight of questions neither of them voiced. The woman crouched down beside his wheelchair, careful not to startle him. Up close, her eyes were calm but focused, like she had done this before, like this wasn't just a random act of kindness. Still, he wasn't sure what to make of her. People had smiled at him before. Some had even thrown $1 in his lap or whispered "thank you for your service" before hurrying away. But none had stayed. He watched her warily, unsure whether to brace himself for a lecture, a sermon, or a pity speech. But she didn't offer any of those. Instead, she simply said, "I saw you." 3 words, quiet but firm. And for a reason he couldn't explain. They stayed with him. She introduced herself family. A social worker, she said, or at least something close. She didn't get into titles, just told him she spent her time out here, looking for people others had forgotten. Her voice wasn't forced or overly sweet. She spoke like someone who had seen a lot, maybe too much, and carried some of it with her. He didn't answer right away. He hadn't had a real conversation in weeks, maybe months. When you spend your days in hospitals and shelters, the language people use with you changes. They talk in checklists, ask for your ID, tell you what time dinner is served or what form to fill out. They don't ask how you got here, and they definitely don't wait for you to answer. But Emily waited. He cleared his throat and managed to tell her his name, Frank. That was enough for now. She nodded, like that was all she needed. But he could see in her eyes that she wanted to know more. And part of him, strangely, wanted to tell her. He hadn't always been like this. He had served 2 tours overseas. The kind of deployments where you lose count of the days and nights and carry the noise with you long after you return. He came back with a limp, some scars, and lungs that weren't what they used to be. But he was proud. He'd worn the flag on his sleeve and believed in the mission, even when it got messy. What he hadn't expected was how hard it would be to come home to nothing. His unit was disbanded. His old friends moved on. He tried to get a job, but the world didn't wait for him. The skills he had in the service didn't seem to matter in job interviews. And when the medical bills started piling up, it didn't take long for everything else to unravel. The apartment went first, then the car, then his phone. One by one, the threads of a normal life came loose, until there was nothing left but hospital visits and borrowed time. Emily didn't flinch when he spoke about it. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer those tired phrases like everything happens for a reason. She just listened. Still, he kept most of it inside. He didn't want to sound bitter. But the truth sat heavy on his chest. He'd been tossed around from clinics to shelters to overcrowded VA offices. There were programs, sure, but the wait lists were long and the follow-ups never came. Eventually, he stopped asking for help. It was easier to disappear than to be. Ignored Don, Emily finally broke the silence. "What happened today?" she asked gently. He glanced away, eyes stinging from more than just the wind. "They said I was stable enough to leave, but not sick enough to stay. I guess I'm nobody's problem now." She didn't argue. She just looked at him like she understood what he meant without needing to hear the rest. There was a pause, and then something shifted in her voice. "You're not the only one, Frank." He looked up at her, confused. "I've met others veterans like you. It's different faces, same story. Promises made, then forgotten. It's not right, but it's real." She stood slowly, brushing dirt off her coat and gestured toward the curb. "Come with me, just for some food. You don't have to talk, just eat something warm." He hesitated. He didn't want to be someone's charity project. But he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and the truth was, the idea of being anywhere but this corner even for a few minutes felt like a relief. So he nodded. They didn't go far. It's just a small diner around the block, the kind of place that still played old jazz on the speakers and served soup that came with real bread. The staff knew Emily. She nodded at the man behind the counter, who didn't blink at Frank's or wheelchair. No questions. Just 2 bowls of stew and water. With lemon, Frank sat quietly at the table while Emily sipped her tea. For the first few minutes, they didn't speak. The food was hot, and he took his time, savoring the warmth as it spread through his body. It had been too long since something simple felt this comforting. Then, slowly, the walls began to drop. He told her more. Not everything, but enough. About the last job he tried to hold. About the landlord who kicked him out when he fell behind. About waking up in shelters where people disappeared overnight or got turned away in the rain. And about how today, when the nurse handed him a discharge slip with nowhere to go, he felt something inside him give up. He hadn't meant to end up on that bridge, but he had rolled closer to it than he'd like to admit. Emily didn't react. With shock or sadness, she just nodded slowly. "That's why I stopped," she said. "Something told me you weren't done yet." Frank looked at her, unsure what to say. A part of him still didn't trust it. People didn't just show up like this, not for someone like him, but something about her felt real. She checked her watch and looked out the window. "There's a center. It's not perfect, but it's clean and quiet. I can take you there tonight. Just stay a few days. No pressure. I'll visit. We'll figure out the rest later." He didn't answer right away. He wasn't ready to hope again, but he also wasn't ready to go back to that corner. And something in him, maybe the last piece that hadn't gone numb, didn't want to feel that. Empty again. He looked at her and gave the smallest nod. Just for tonight, he told himself. But, deep down, something had already started to shift. The ride to the center was quiet, the hum of the wheels and distant traffic filling the space between them. Frank sat in the back of the van, watching the city blur past the windows. It was late now, and the streets had emptied, leaving behind flickering signs and trash caught in the wind. It's a kind of stillness that made everything feel heavier. Emily didn't speak much, just offered him a blanket and told him to rest if he wanted. But rest felt foreign to Frank. His mind was racing not from fear exactly, but from something harder to explain. Part of him still expected this to fall apart, that the center would turn him away, that Emily would disappear like the others, who once promised help but never showed up again. He didn't want to admit how much he was depending on her kindness already. It scared him more than he liked to admit. When they pulled into the quiet lot, the place didn't look like much. A low building tucked behind a row of trees. No big signs, just a small light over the door. Inside, it smelled of coffee and floor. Cleaner, a receptionist waved without asking questions. Emily seemed to know her too. Frank was taken to a small room, nothing fancy, just a bed, a nightstand, and a chair. But to him, It felt like shelter. He settled in slowly, unsure if he could let his guard down. That night, sleep came in short bursts. Every noise made him jump. The memories returned in flash of sirens, sandstorms shouting in the distance. Even after all these years, his body still braced for impact. In the quiet moments, he stared at the ceiling and thought about all the faces he'd lost. The friends who hadn't come back. The ones who had, only to end up like him, drifting, forgotten. The next morning, Emily returned with coffee and a folder. She wasn't pushy, but she was prepared. Inside were documents, paperwork for housing assistance, medical evaluations, lists of organizations that offered veteran support. But Frank had seen these before. The long forms, confusing, rules, the wait lists that stretched for months. He flipped through it slowly, then looked up at her. "They don't make this easy," he muttered. She didn't deny it. "They don't," she said. "But you're not alone this time." That line stuck with him. Maybe it was true. Or maybe it was just another promise that couldn't hold up against the weight of reality. Still, he kept the folder. Days turned into a week. Frank stayed at the center, keeping mostly to himself. He met a few other veterans with similar stories. One man, Robert, had served in Iraq and was dealing with PTSD that made it hard for him to sleep more than an hour at a time. Another, Louise, had lost both legs to an IED and was waiting for proper prosthetics that had been delayed for over a year. They all carried different versions of the same burden. Conversations in the common room were quiet but honest. No one needed to explain the nightmares, the panic attacks, or the strange numbness that followed them through the day. They got it. They all did. There was comfort in that, even if it didn't fix anything. But not everything in the center felt safe. Frank had noticed one staff member, Tom, who seemed to carry more authority than the others. He wore a clean button-up, spoke in clipped sentences, and had a clipboard tucked under his arm at all times. But something about him rubbed Frank the wrong way. Tom asked too many questions, and not in a caring way. He'd pop in at odd times, checking rooms, making notes, asking veterans how long they planned to stay. One afternoon, Frank overheard Tom on the phone saying something about budget cuts and rotating residents out more quickly. That sent a chill down his spine. He knew what that meant. More people on the streets, more vets dumped before they were ready. Just like him at the hospital, Frank brought it up to Emily during their next meeting. She didn't look surprised, but she didn't look happy either. "He's not in charge of everything," she said quietly. "But he has influence. I've been fighting him on this for months." Frank realized then that Emily wasn't just a kind face. She was in the middle of something much bigger. Broken system with cracks so wide, people were falling through every day. And now that he was on the inside, he could feel the pressure. He started to wonder how many others had been quietly pushed out. Their files marked voluntary discharge even when they had nowhere else to go. The deeper he looked, the more stories he found. One of the newer residents, Janine, a former Army medic, had been denied medication for a back injury because of a paperwork error. Another, Sam, said his disability checks had stopped suddenly, and no one could explain why. Frank knew the signs. These weren't accidents. These were consequences of a system stretched thin and managed by people who didn't always care. Frank began writing everything down: names, dates, conversations he overheard. It gave him a purpose, something to focus on beyond the constant hum of doubt in his head. Emily noticed the change. She offered to connect him with a veteran legal group that had helped. Others pushed back against housing denials and benefit cuts. Frank didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he was ready to fight again. But the conflict was coming too. Him, whether he wanted it or not. That weekend, Tom called Frank into his office. The mood was polite on the surface, but Frank felt the chill behind his words. Tom asked questions about his status, how long he intended to stay, whether he had applied for other programs yet. The message was clear. Time was running out. When Frank pushed back, asked about the veterans who'd been discharged early, the missing services, Tom's tone shifted. "We help who we can, but we're not responsible for fixing everyone," he said. "Resources are limited. Maybe it's time you think about moving on." Frank left the room with his hands shaking. Not from fear, from anger. That familiar, knot in his stomach returned. The same one he had felt when the hospital turned him out, when the world looked the other way. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had notes. He had names. A T. He knew things were about to get harder. Pushing back against people like Tom came with consequences. Frank could already sense the shift. Staff members who once smiled now avoided his eyes. A form he submitted for medical transport mysteriously went missing. And one of the vets he had spoken to suddenly vanished with no explanation. The center, once a quiet refuge, now felt like a tightrope walk. One wrong move, and he'd be back on the street. But something had changed in Frank. The part of him that once wanted to disappear had found a reason to stay visible. There were others counting on someone to speak up. And even if he didn't know where this road would lead, he couldn't turn away now. Not when the fight had finally come into focus. Frank woke up to the sound of hushed voices outside his room. It was still dark, but something about the tone didn't sit right. He sat up slowly, listening. A few words filtered through. Evaluation, budget review, rotation list, S. Name wasn't said out loud, but he could feel it in the air. It was only a matter of time now. He got dressed quietly and slipped out, wheeling himself toward the hallway where the voices had come from. The corridor was dimly lit, and by the time he reached the lounge, it was empty again. But something had shifted. The tension was thicker than before. A paper lay half-tucked under the edge of the front desk. He reached for it, his hands trembling. As he pulled it free, it was a list half the names he recognized. Veterans still inside the building, men and women trying to get back on their feet. And next to some of their names were words written in red pen. Non-priority, temporary stay. Expired, discharge, scheduled. Frank's chest tightened. These weren't just notes, they were decisions. Quiet removals of people with nowhere else to go. He went straight to Emily. She looked exhausted when she opened the door, eyes heavy with lack of sleep, hair tied back in a messy knot. But the moment she saw the paper in his hand, she knew. She stepped aside and let him in without a word. Frank placed the list on the table between them. "It's happening again," he said. "They're clearing people out. No notice, no warning." Emily nodded, her jaw clenched. "They've been pushing for it behind the scenes. I've been trying to stall, but Tom's got backing now. Private. Donors, some pressure from above. They want faster turnover, more success stories for their reports. But at what cost?" Frank's voice cracked, louder than he meant it to be. "These people aren't numbers. They're barely hanging on." "I know," she said quietly. For the first time, Frank saw something break in her expression. She wasn't just frustrated, she was scared. "They want me out too," she added. "They say I'm causing delays, stirring things up. I have. A few days left, maybe less." It hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily, the only person who had shown up when no one else did, was being pushed out, just like the rest of them. Just like him. "We can't let this happen," Frank said, his voice low but urgent. "We have to do something." Emily hesitated. "There's a reporter, someone I trust. She's been looking into treatment of homeless veterans, especially in these centers. If I can get her here, maybe we can shine a light on what's happening." "Do it," Frank said. "I'll back you I'll talk. I'll tell her everything." The next few days moved like a storm brewing quietly but fast. Frank spoke with Luis and Robert and a few others who were still at the center. They were scared some more than others, but they agreed to talk. Most had seen too much to trust anyone, but Frank's courage gave them something to believe in, if only for a little while. Emily kept things quiet. She told the reporter to come in as a volunteer, someone who wouldn't raise suspicion. Her name was Jessica. Sharp eyes, calm voice. She listened more than she spoke and took notes without making anyone feel small. She met with the veterans one by one, sitting with them in corners of the dining area, in the outdoor space behind the building, even in the laundry room. Every story was different, but the pattern was the same: promises made, help delayed, and silence when things went wrong. Frank gave her everything. He had his notes, his memories, the way the system had folded on him after service. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her about the hospital discharge, the loneliness, the bridge. And he told her about the list. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, thoughts racing. What if none of it worked? What if Tom found out? What if this only made things worse? The next morning, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board near the entrance. A list of upcoming discharges. 6 names. Frank's was one of them. No date. Just a bold red stamp. Review complete. His heart sank. He took the paper down and brought it to Emily. She looked at it, then at him. "They've made their move," she said. "They're trying to sweep this before it spreads." Jessica hadn't published anything yet. She was still fact-checking, reaching out to VA offices, building the story carefully. Time was running out. Frank went back to his room and stared at his few belongings. A jacket, a pair of boots, the folder Emily had given him. For a long time, he didn't move. The fear came back, pressing against his ribs like it had the day he left the hospital. Only now, it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone in that building who had nowhere else to go. Everyone who still believed this place might help them. And about Emily, who had risked everything by simply caring. By evening, tension had spread like wildfire. Staff were whispering. Some veterans packed up quietly, trying not to draw attention. Others grew angrier, louder, demanding answers. Tom had increased security. Notice went out, banning unauthorized media. Frank knew what was coming. They were going to shut it all down before the story could surface, and that's when he made his choice. The next morning, during a routine community meeting held in the dining hall, Frank rolled to the front. He didn't ask for permission. Didn't wait for someone to introduce him. He just looked around at the faces, tired, worn, broken, but listening. "I know some of you are scared," he began, voice steady. "I am too. But we've got to stop waiting for someone else to fix this." A few heads turned. A few more nodded. "They're trying to silence us. Push us out before people find out what's really happening here. But we can't let that happen. We served this country. We are promised care, dignity, a chance to rebuild. And now they want us quiet." The room grew still. "I've spoken to a reporter. So have others. Our stories matter, but we need all of you. We need to stand together. Not tomorrow. Now." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't polished. But it hit home. Robert stood up next. Then Janine. Then Luis. One by one, voices rose. Veterans who hadn't spoken in weeks now stood in support. Fear turned into energy. Silence cracked wide open. Outside the door, Tom stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. Frank locked eyes with him for a second. Neither man looked away. The storm was no longer coming. It had begun. Just as the tension inside the dining hall began to settle into purpose, The front doors slammed open. Two unfamiliar men in suits stepped in, flanked by a third holding a clipboard. They didn't wear name tags, but their presence was loud without saying a word. Tom followed close behind them, smug, as if reinforcements had finally arrived. Conversations in the room died out. The energy that had sparked only minutes ago began to flicker. Frank instinctively pushed his chair back slightly, eyes narrowing. Emily appeared from the hallway, rushing in with a frown. She looked from the newcomers to Tom, then back at the clipboard one of them was holding. Her voice was calm but sharp. "What's this?" The man with the clipboard didn't answer her directly. He turned to the group instead. "We're conducting a compliance inspection, effective immediately. This facility is undergoing an administrative audit. All residents will be temporarily relocated while we conduct internal reviews." A stunned silence followed, then murmurs, then confusion. Relocated, that meant gone. Dispersed, scattered to who knows where. It wasn't just a shutdown, they were erasing the whole place before the story could even go. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. "You're shutting this place down?" he asked, voice cracking just enough to carry emotion, but still firm. The man didn't even make eye contact. "This is a procedural step, nothing permanent. You'll be notified." It was a lie. Everyone knew it. Jessica, the reporter, hadn't published the article yet. She had told Emily she needed one more day. One more day to verify sources, to finalize testimony. And now they were going to scatter the entire group before that day could come. Emily stepped forward. "You don't have the authority to relocate residents without legal notice. These veterans have rights." The man flashed a thin smile. "And this facility has violations. Fire code, security, medical storage compliance. We have orders. Unless you'd like to challenge them in court, I suggest you cooperate." Frank looked around the room. Janine's shoulders were tense, and Robert clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't just a sweep, it was a message. "Shut up or get out." He turned to Emily. "Can we stop this?" She looked back, her face pale. "Not like this. Not today." Outside, vans began pulling into the lot. No logos, no markings, just plain white vehicles. Like they were preparing for some silent evacuation. Frank rolled forward and faced the group again. "Don't go. Not until we get the story out. If they separate us now, we lose everything." But fear was creeping in fast. Some residents began gathering their things. Others were already being called into private rooms for reassignment. Tom stood in the corner, arms crossed, eyes watching like a hawk. Jessica hadn't shown up yet. Frank turned to Emily again. "Call her now." Emily hesitated only a second before stepping out with her phone. Back inside, Frank did what he never thought he'd do. He spoke louder than he had in years. "Everyone, listen to me. I know this looks bad. And maybe you're thinking it's easier to just go quietly and not cause trouble. But I've seen where that road leads. We don't come back from silence. Not this time." The others listened. Some still gathered their things, unsure. Some sat frozen, like deer in headlights. Then came the sound of footsteps fast once. Jessica burst through the door, breathless, holding a bag and a camera. "I got your message," she said to Emily, who followed close behind. Tom stepped forward. "You're not authorized to be here." Jessica didn't blink. "And you're not authorized to displace veterans without federal clearance. This facility is partly funded by the VA. I've already contacted legal counsel." The suits exchanged a quick glance. One of them pulled out a phone, stepping outside to make a call. The other two stayed, but they didn't look so sure of themselves anymore. Jessica turned to the group. "I'm recording now. If anyone wants to speak, this is the time." For a second, No one moved. Then Janine stood. "I came here with a prescription for pain management and was told they were out of stock. For 2 weeks. I couldn't sleep, couldn't walk, and they told me to wait my turn. Then, Robert, they promised job placement. I've been here 6 months, not a single interview. They lost my paperwork twice." Voices began rising, one after another. A wave of truth finally breaking open. Jessica filmed it all, not just with her camera, but with her eyes. She saw them, not as numbers, not as a charity case, but as people with names, histories, and wounds that never fully healed. Tom barked something about policy and consent, but it was too late. The energy had returned, stronger this time. Not just survival, but resistance. Frank sat still, heart pounding. Then Jessica looked at him. "Do you want to add anything?" He stared at the camera for a long moment. "I was left at a hospital curb with an IV still in my arm. No family. Number? Home. And when I sat in a wheelchair holding a sign that said I was betrayed by the country I served, no one even looked twice. This place? It was supposed to help. But now they want to tear it down before anyone hears the truth." Jessica nodded and turned the camera off. Side. The man with the phone came back in. "We've been advised to halt relocation, temporarily." It was a small win, a delay. But it was enough for now. Frank exhaled slowly. The fight was far from over. The audit was still coming. The funding was still at risk. But the story was out, and someone had finally listened. But something still didn't sit right. Later that evening, after the building had quieted, Frank sat with Emily in the common room. "I don't think this was just about shutting the place down," he said. She looked at him, brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward Tom's office door. "This feels bigger, coordinated, like someone wanted to erase us completely." Emily nodded slowly. "Then we'll have to go deeper." The center had survived the day, but the storm was far from over. The next morning came with a heavy stillness in the air. Frank barely slept. He sat by the window in the small lounge, watching the sun crawl above the trees, knowing this day would be different. The center was quieter than usual, tense, like everyone was waiting for something to snap. The staff kept their heads down. Even Tom hadn't shown up yet, which was unusual. But Frank knew better than to believe that meant the pressure was off. Jessica's footage had made waves. The night before, she had stayed up in Emily's office editing the first cut of the story. By morning, it was live shared on local news. And veteran support networks even picking up steam on social media under hashtags like #ForgottenVets and #HonorThemNow. Messages began pouring in. From other vets, from journalists, even from a few politicians who suddenly wanted to look into the matter that should have been a victory. But Frank knew better. Exposure could bring help, but it also brought heat. By noon, 3 government vehicles rolled up in front of the center. This time, they weren't here to shut things down quietly. 2 suited officials stepped out, flanked by a younger woman, holding a tablet. Behind them, Tom appeared from the back lot, looking tense and angry, but trying to hold his composure. Emily stood on the steps to meet them, arms crossed. Frank wheeled himself close by. The lead official introduced herself as Agent Clark, a representative from a federal oversight agency tied to veteran services. She spoke formally, but there was no doubt she meant business. "We're here to conduct a full investigation into the center's management and care practices. We'll be speaking with staff and residents." Tom tried to cut in, something about procedure, but she stopped him cold. "You've had your chance. Step aside." Inside, residents gathered, watching nervously as rooms were inspected and files pulled. Clark's team didn't miss a thing. Within hours, they uncovered inconsistencies in medication logs, incomplete mental health referrals, and reports that had been altered, names missing, dates changed. Emily had suspected it, but seeing the proof made her face harden with anger. Frank was called in to speak last. He sat across from Clark and told her everything again, this time under oath. Every forgotten appointment, every missing record, every silent dismissal that had pushed him closer to the edge. He didn't cry, he didn't yell, he just told the truth. When he finished, she sat in silence for a moment before nodding. "You're not the first person to report these kinds of issues," she said, "but you might be the one that forces us to act." The investigation wrapped late in the evening. Tom was asked to turn over his badge and escorted from the building. Some of the staff who had turned a blind eye quietly cleared their desks. Others, nurses and caseworkers who had been afraid to speak, finally opened up. The center wasn't being shut down, not this time. Instead, it would be placed under new management. With federal supervision and additional resources, it felt like a victory. The residents cheered. Emily cried for the first time since Frank had met her. Jessica hugged him and promised to keep following the story. Luis returned to the center that night, having heard about the changes. "Figured I'd give it one more shot," he said with a smile. Frank sat alone in the garden behind the center, the sky deep blue above him. For the first time in years, he felt something solid under his feet, if he wasn't standing. He had been seen, heard, and believed. But just as he let himself exhale, Emily approached with a strange look on her face. "There's something you need to see," she said, holding a file. It was a copy of the original discharge paperwork from the hospital where this all began. Frank frowned, flipping through the pages until he saw something odd. His signature, but it wasn't his. "Wait," he whispered, leaning closer. "That's not mine." Emily nodded. "I checked, it's forged." A chill ran down his spine. She turned to the last page, and this named Dr. Harold Kingston. "He hasn't worked at that hospital in 2 years. But he signed your discharge." Frank sat back, stunned. Why would they fake my release? Emily's eyes were serious. A tease. Because they needed to clear space for a high-profile donor's relative. They pushed you out to make room and covered it up. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was corruption. Emily had already forwarded the file to Jessica. She had connections, now real ones. What started as a local human interest story was about to crack something much bigger. Frank didn't say anything. At first, he looked out toward the edge of the garden where the wind rustled the leaves of a small tree. After everything, there was still more to uncover. But he wasn't scared anymore. He was ready. He turned back to Emily, voice low but certain. "Let's finish what we started." Frank sat still, letting the weight of the discovery settle in. That forged signature explained everything. He had always felt like something about his hospital discharge didn't add up. But he'd been too tired, too worn down to fight it. Now he knew the truth. He hadn't been released because he was stable, he had been removed to make space for someone more important. The idea made his stomach turn, but the anger that had once paralyzed him now felt like fuel. It wasn't just about what happened to him anymore. It was about making sure it didn't keep happening to others like him. Jessica worked fast. The next week, she released a follow-up report with documents Emily had uncovered, tying the forged discharge to a hospital administrator who'd approved multiple questionable releases over the last year. Her story ran deeper this time. It wasn't just a heartbreaking piece about a sick veteran left in the cold. It was an exposed one that pointed fingers, named names, and demanded accountability. The fallout came quickly. The hospital launched an internal investigation. The administrator resigned within days. A congressional committee opened a review into patient treatment and record handling for veterans. especially those with disabilities or without family advocates. Advocacy groups began using Frank's story to push for stronger protections for homeless veterans and those being discharged from care. What started on one sidewalk outside a hospital had sparked something that reached all the way to Washington. At the center, changes were already visible. The new director, a retired Army colonel with a no-nonsense tone and a deep respect for the people inside those walls, held meetings with the residents regularly. Staff who stayed were given proper training. The building itself began to shift cleaner, more organized, more humane. The energy was different. Veterans weren't just being processed and passed through. They were being treated like people. Again, Luis finally got his prosthetics. Janine started physical therapy for her back. Robert was connected with a trauma counselor and began attending sessions twice a week. Slowly, the weight each of them carried started to feel a little less impossible. Frank, for his part, began volunteering. He led small meetings where new residents could share their stories, vent their frustrations, and feel heard. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he listened on sometimes. That was enough. One afternoon, he wheeled past the bridge where everything had nearly ended for him. He sat there for a long while, just watching the water below. It wasn't about the fall anymore. It was about the return. He thought about the cold air that day, the silence, the moment he almost disappeared, and then the tap on his shoulder. Emily. Everything had changed because one person had stopped long enough to care. He met with her later that evening, under the soft glow of the center's courtyard lights. She looked tired but relieved. They had done something real, something lasting. It didn't fix everything. There were still people falling through the cracks. Still policies that failed the most vulnerable, but it was a start. Frank smiled faintly as he looked around. "You know," he said, "when I first got here, I thought I had nothing left. I figured the most I could hope for was a quiet place to wait out the rest of my days." Emily glanced over at him. "And now? I think I've still got a few good years left in me," he said with a chuckle. "Maybe more than a few." She laughed, then grew quiet for a moment. "There's something about what you did speaking up. Standing firm reminded people that we're not dealing with statistics. We're dealing with lives. With people who gave everything and came back to find nothing." Frank nodded slowly. Sometimes, all it takes is someone to remind you you're still worth fighting for. News outlets continued to reach out, wanting follow-up interviews, but Frank turned most of them down. He didn't want to become a symbol or a talking point. He just wanted to live. Quietly, honestly, with dignity. He accepted one interview, just one, with a veterans podcast where he spoke about hope, perseverance, and how healing sometimes starts in the smallest moments. Like a stranger offering soup or someone asking your name. Over time, he reconnected with an old friend from his unit, a fellow vet who had lost touch years ago. They started writing letters back and forth, then talking on the phone. That led to visits, and before long, they were working together to organize local meets for veterans who felt lost and forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was something. Frank still had his wheelchair, still needed the oxygen some days. But he also had something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. One day, months after everything had settled, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the hospital. An official apology signed by the new director. It included a promise to change discharge protocols, review all past cases, and never again allow patients, especially veterans, to be removed without proper oversight and aftercare. Frank folded the letter and placed it in a box on his nightstand. Alongside a few photos, the original cardboard sign he'd held that day, and a dog tag from his first deployment. He didn't need the apology to heal, but knowing that someone had finally taken responsibility, that mattered. Outside, the sun was setting. He wheeled himself to the garden, passing Robert and Janine, playing a quiet game of cards. A few younger. Veterans were sitting in a circle, joking, sharing stories, trying to reclaim their laughter. Frank didn't interrupt. He just smiled and kept moving, finding his usual spot beneath the small tree in the corner. The wind brushed his face, gentle now. Softer than before. He took a breath and looked up at the sky. He was still here, still standing. In his own way, and finally, not invisible anymore.